At the family will reading, my uncle said, "You're just the maid's daughter he couldn't let go of." My cousin mocked, "Guess he had a weak spot for strays." I looked down. Then the executive pulled out a key and said, "He left something hidden. In the clock tower. Only you know why." "I still don't know what you're doing here," Rowan muttered, half smiling as he sipped from a crystal tumbler. I stayed quiet, keeping my eyes on the executive. "You're just the maid's daughter he couldn't let go of," Uncle Dominic added with a shrug, as if he were stating a mildly inconvenient truth. Selene raised one eyebrow. "Some people don't know when they're not invited." Rowan leaned in again. "Guess he had a weak spot for strays." I looked down, my fingers curled around the edge of my chair to keep from shaking. That's when Mr. Lennox, the executive, reached into his leather case and placed a brass key on the table. "He left something in the clock tower," he said, sliding it toward me. "Only you know why." I wasn't supposed to be there. That's what every sideways glance, every strange smile in that old mansion told me. It had been 10 years since I last stepped foot in the Ashford estate, the sprawling Victorian manor on the marshy edge of Beaufort, South Carolina. 10 years since I left and told myself I wouldn't look back. But when I received a curtail from Mr. Lennox informing me of Alden Ashford's death and the reading of his will, I felt something stir, not grief, something more complicated. I packed a small bag and drove down from Charleston the night before, unsure of what I was walking into. I had grown up in that house, but never as one of the family. My mother, Isolde, had been the maid for the Ashfords since before I was born. She was a quiet woman with tired eyes and kind hands who kept her secrets close. She never said who my father was, only that he was someone who couldn't be with us openly. I didn't need her to say it, I saw it. Alden was always kind to me in his own reserved way. He brought me books from his study, paid for my braces when my mother couldn't, and once even defended me when Selene accused me of stealing a necklace. Still, I never called him anything but Mr. Ashford, and he never called me anything but Mira. He never introduced me to guests, never acknowledged me when the family was around. Even as a child, I knew I was a secret. When I arrived for the reading, I wasn't surprised that the entire family was already seated. Dominic, Selene, Rowan, and 2 other relatives I barely recognized. They all looked like they belonged there, like their seats had always been waiting for them. The room hadn't changed. The high ceilings, the thick curtains, the grandfather clock standing like a sentry in the corner, all preserved, untouched by time. I stood out the second I walked in. Selene looked me up and down, still shopping at the bookstore thrift. Rowan laughed. I ignored them and sat in the only open seat, the one no one wanted, next to the cold fireplace. Mr. Lennox began reading the will in a steady, measured voice. There was no poetry, no warmth, just cold divisions of wealth and real estate. To Dominic, the majority of Alden's stocks and bond portfolios. To Selene, a modest endowment and art pieces from the East Gallery. To Rowan, the vintage cars, a yacht in Hilton Head, and access to a trust fund. Standard stuff for an old money family. Then he paused, and lastly Mr. Lennox said, "To Mira Ashford." Before he could finish, Dominic scoffed, "She's not an Ashford." My mouth was dry, but I said nothing. I had learned silence was my best armor. Rowan leaned in, the smirk never leaving his face. "You're just the maid's daughter he couldn't let go of." That was when Selene added under her breath, but loud enough for me to hear, "She's not even blood, just a shadow that got too close to the light." I stared at the grain of the table, counted my breaths. Rowan chuckled and said, "Guess he had a weak spot for strays." I didn't look at them, didn't flinch, just waited. Then Mr. Lennox reached into his case and pulled out a small brass key. It was aged, ornate, and unmistakable. "He left something hidden in the clock tower," he said, placing the key in front of me. "Only you know why." I knew exactly what it was. I had been in that tower once when I was 12. Alden had taken me up there late one afternoon. A strange, quiet ritual. He told me not to tell anyone. He'd shown me a box hidden in a cavity behind a wall panel. The space smelled like dust and oil, and the sun had slanted through the cracked stained glass in strange colors. He told me it was something important, but that I wasn't allowed to touch it until I was grown. Then he left. He never spoke of it again. I never forgot. So when the key slid across that polished table, it wasn't just a key to the clock tower. It was a key to the truth. I returned to the mansion that night, long after the others had left. The housekeeper, one I didn't recognize, let me in. She said Mr. Lennox had called ahead. I climbed the winding staircase to the tower, each step creaking like a secret being revealed. The gears of the old clock loomed above, still frozen at 2:17, behind the wall, panel. The box was still there, covered in a thin layer of dust but intact. I turned the key inside. I found a thick journal and a stack of envelopes. The journal was Alden's. I recognized his firm, deliberate handwriting. The first page stopped me cold. To my daughter Mira, you were my greatest secret and my greatest regret. My knees buckled and I sank to the floor, the journal in my lap. Page after page revealed everything. He had loved my mother, Pui, but he hadn't had the strength to defy his family or the social expectations tied to the Ashford name. Dominic had discovered the affair, and the fallout was nearly catastrophic. In the end, Alden had chosen silence, the family, the legacy, over us. But he never stopped watching over me. He paid for my education, ensured I got medical care, quietly transferred money to my mother over the years, and more than that, he confessed that he had legally acknowledged me in a private document dated and notarized, kept sealed with his final testament. There were deeds in my name, not just to the bookstore apartment in Charleston, which I always thought was owned by an anonymous investor, but to 2 other properties. And at the bottom of the box was one final envelope addressed to Mr. Lennox. It was dated 6 months before Alden's death. Inside the envelope addressed to Mr. Lennox was a copy of Alden's amended will, different from the version read earlier in The Day. This one bore his signature as well as 2 witness signatures, all verified and dated. In it, he had added a final clause, something the family hadn't heard yet. He had named me, Mira Isolde Ashford, as the rightful heir to the Ashford estate, the mansion, the surrounding land, the historical holdings, and most notably, controlling interest in the Ashford Family Trust. The only condition was that I publicly accept the Ashford name, not because he wanted to force it on me, but because, as he wrote, what I could not do in life, I must do in death. They must see that my silence was not a denial of you, but a failure of courage. You are my legacy. I sat on the cold floor of the clock tower for hours, reading through every page of that journal. Every legal clause, every date and confession and apology, scribbled in that tightly packed handwriting. It was overwhelming, emotional, and above all, clarifying. All my life I'd tiptoed around my origins, accepted half-truths, buried the ache of being invisible in my own home. That night, for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full truth of who I was, not the maid's daughter, not the stray they pitied. I was his daughter. The following day, I asked to meet with Mr. Lennox privately. We sat in his small, cluttered office just a few blocks from downtown Beaufort, and he confirmed everything. Yes, Alden had made changes to the will in secret, without the family's knowledge. Yes, he had filed them legally, but had instructed Lennox to wait until I had opened the box in the clock tower before delivering the updated terms. He looked at me kindly as he slid the documents across his desk. "They're going to fight this," he said. "You understand that, right?" I nodded. "They'll accuse you of coercion, call it forgery, dig into your past, try to invalidate everything." "I know," I said, "but I'm not backing down." Mr. Lennox gave me a thin smile. "Good, because the truth is on your side, and I've been waiting a long time for Alden to do right by you." I didn't call the Ashfords. I didn't owe them a warning. But 3 days later, I received a letter, formal, typed, and dripping with legalese. Dominic, Celine, and Rowan were contesting the updated will. They were claiming undue influence, mental, incapacity, and improper handling by Mr. Lennox. Typical. I hired a lawyer, a good one, a woman named Joan Mary, who had a reputation for being as sharp as a scalpel and twice as unrelenting. She reviewed the documents, raised one eyebrow, and said, "You've got the truth. That's enough. Now, let's make them eat it." We spent weeks preparing. I was deposed, questioned, subtly insulted by their attorneys who treated me like a social climber who'd manipulated an old man. They asked about my mother's intentions, about whether I had ever been coached, and even tried to paint me as an opportunist who had fabricated a connection with a dying patriarch. But then, we submitted the journal. Then the notarized paternity test signed by Alden and dated 5 years before his death. Then the financial records tracing trust fund allocations in my name going back to when I was 15. And when they deposed Mr. Lennox, his testimony sealed it. Alden knew exactly what he was doing. He had even anticipated that they would try to bury me under litigation. That's why he left detailed instructions and timelines. Every accusation they made crumbled under the weight of facts. The final arbitration hearing was held in Savannah, in a plain courtroom with water-stained ceilings and humming fluorescent lights, a far cry from the opulence of the Ashford estate. Rowan sat across the room in a navy suit, too tight across, the shoulders, arms crossed like a petulant teenager. Celine wore oversized sunglasses and didn't look up once. Dominic looked old, tired, bitter. I wore a simple black dress and brought nothing but a folder and the original key to the clock tower. I didn't say much. I let the evidence speak. The truth doesn't need dramatics. When the judge ruled in my favor, there was no cheer, no applause, just silence and a slow exhale. I hadn't realized I'd been holding it for decades. They didn't look at me, not even once. I returned to the estate alone. The house was quiet, too quiet, empty of the noise, the judgment, the cold expectations it had once housed. For the first time, it felt like it belonged to someone who might treat it differently. I walked from room to room, remembering the years I'd spent cleaning baseboards, folding napkins, fetching drinks for guests who didn't know my name. I remembered my mother standing in the back stairwell, wiping sweat from her brow while the Ashfords laughed upstairs. And I remembered Alden, the way he used to stand on the front porch at dusk, staring out at the marsh, hands behind his back. He had been many things, powerful, flawed, cowardly in some ways, but he had tried to do right by me in the only way he knew how. Too late, maybe, but not too little. I didn't move in right away. The idea of living in that house, sleeping under the same roof where I had once been a shadow, was too strange. Instead, I had the entire place assessed for structural safety and historical preservation. There were repairs to make, renovations to plan, and legal processes to finalize. I hired a local architecture firm that specialized in restoring heritage homes. But I also started something else, a quiet, deliberate transformation. I turned my old bedroom, once the maid's quarters, into a writing room. I began cataloging Alden's journal, transcribing it, organizing the documents into a family archive. Not to honor him blindly, but to preserve the complicated truth. And one afternoon, while organizing old ledgers in the study, I found something that made me freeze. A second journal, smaller, my mother's. It had been tucked behind a row of law books, thin, leather-bound, the pages delicate with age. I sat down in the same chair Alden used to occupy and opened the first page. For Mari, someday if the truth finds you, I want you to know my heart. All of it. The handwriting in my mother's journal was neat, controlled, almost painfully so. Each letter seemed placed with care, as if she were afraid of what might spill out if she didn't keep herself tightly in check. The first few pages detailed things I already knew: long shifts, hidden migraines, the hours she spent on her feet, cleaning that massive house, top to bottom. But then the entries changed. Slowly, carefully. She peeled back layers I had never seen. He wasn't cruel to me. That's what I want you to know first. Alden was never cruel, but he was weak, in the ways men are when they've been handed power their whole lives and never had to use it to protect anyone but themselves. She wrote about the affair with a kind of resigned tenderness. There was no anger in her words, but there was pain, measured, buried, and chronicled only in the quietest way. He said, "He loved me." I believed him, but love that can't be spoken is its own kind of imprisonment, and I couldn't raise you in chains. There were entries about when she found out she was pregnant, how she tried to leave, but Alden offered to take care of everything, as long as she stayed quiet. Dominic had already suspected. Celine had cornered her once, saying cruel things I won't repeat. But the most heartbreaking part came later. You asked me once why we stayed. I told you I needed the work. That was only part of it. I stayed because I thought maybe if you were close to him, he'd love you better than he loved me. Maybe you'd grow up with some of the softness he was afraid to show the world. And later, I didn't know what kind of woman you'd become, Mary, but I always hoped you'd be braver than me. I closed the journal and rested it on my lap, staring at the fire that now burned quietly in the study hearth. This house had seen so much silence, so much pretending, but these pages, these private admissions, they shattered all that. I wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet, but I could finally begin to understand him, and her, and myself. That night, I sat alone in the dining room where the will had been read just a week earlier. The long oak table stretched before me like a courtroom. I imagined all of them in their seats. Dominic, with his stiff posture, Celine, with her tight-lipped disdain, Rowan, with his perpetual smirk, and I saw myself, not as I had been that day, shrinking, folding inward, letting their words cut through me, but as I was now, still, quiet, still deliberate but unshaken. I poured myself a glass of wine and raised it. Not in a toast, but in defiance. Whatever they believed, whatever they'd said, they couldn't take this from me. Not anymore. Over the next few weeks, word began to spread. The contested will ruling had been quietly published in the legal section of the Beaufort Gazette, and tongues started wagging, as they always do in a town where history and gossip are inseparable. A woman from the local historical society came by, asking if I'd be open to discussing the estate's history for a preservation grant. I said yes, not because I wanted recognition, but because I wanted to tell the real story, one that didn't start and end with old money and social climbing, one that included my mother and me, but not everyone took the news gracefully. One afternoon, I returned from a meeting with Mira to find an envelope taped to the estate's front door. Inside was a single photograph, an old black and white snapshot of my mother, carrying a laundry basket in the backyard, probably taken without her knowing. The back scrolled in capital letters, "She'll never be one of these and neither will you." No signature, no return address. I wasn't surprised, and I wasn't scared. I burned it in the fireplace that night, letting the flames eat away at every corner of their resentment. They could keep trying to drag me down, into the same bitterness that consumed them, but I had something they never would. The truth. I began making changes to the house, not sweeping renovations, those would come later. These were quieter, more symbolic. I took down portraits of Dominic and Celine from the west hallway and replaced them with sketches I found in Alden's private collection. Drawings of the marsh, my mother's silhouette in the garden, and a small charcoal piece labeled simply MK. I knew what the initials meant. I reopened the East Wing, which had been closed for over a decade, and turned the parlor into a reading room for local students. Stocked it with books from Alden's private library, annotated volumes thick with his handwritten notes. I left his comments in place for others to see that he had once considered ideas larger than himself, and I dusted off the piano in the music room, the one my mother used to polish every week. It hadn't been played in years. I started teaching myself one chord at a time, not because I was good, but because it felt like a way to breathe life back into the house. My house. Then, one morning, Rowan showed up. I saw him through the window, walking up the long gravel driveway with a hesitant gait that didn't match the smugness I remembered. I considered not answering the door, but curiosity won. When I opened it, he didn't speak for a few seconds. He looked around at the freshly painted shutters, the trimmed hedges, the new life being breathed into the estate. "You really did it," he said finally. I didn't respond. He shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not here to fight or anything, I just I needed to see it, so I said nothing. He looked down, then back at me. Did he really care about you? I mean, more than us? I studied his face. Rowan had always been a tormentor, but he was also a product of the family's cold ambition, a boy raised to believe that love was conditional and earned through power. I think, I said quietly, he cared about me in the way he wasn't allowed to care about anyone else. Rowan nodded once, swallowed hard, and turned to go. He didn't look back. I didn't watch him leave. I had no interest in revenge. I wasn't going to kick them out of their summer homes, or seize the cars, or freeze the remaining funds. That would have made me like them. And I'd spent too long being treated as less than to become a reflection of the very people who tried to erase me. But I also wasn't going to forget they had tried to write me out of the story. Now I was writing myself in. After Rowan's visit, word spread quickly through the family grapevine. For weeks, I heard nothing from Dominic or Celine, just the silence of bruised egos and hollow strategy. But their silence wasn't surrender. It was the kind that simmers. Then a letter arrived, formal again, from Elias's law firm. They were requesting a meeting, not in court but privately at the estate. I debated whether to entertain them at all, but in the end I agreed. There's something powerful about letting the people who tried to bury you walk through the front doors of the house they once guarded so jealously, only to realize they're now guests, that their names are no longer written on the brass plate by the gate. The day they arrived, I wore no makeup, no jewelry, just a simple cream blouse, black slacks, and the quiet strength of someone who had outlived their judgment. Leora arrived first, thin-lipped and stiff. Dominic followed, still walking like he owned the floors, only this time his confidence had an edge of desperation to it. They walked through the foyer like people trying to remember where they fit, but the rooms didn't recognize them anymore. We sat in the front drawing room, the one where the will had been read. I offered tea. They declined. Dominic got straight to the point. We'd like to propose a restructuring, he said, setting a folder down on the table between us. You've inherited something with a long legacy. We think it would be wise for the public image, for the name itself, if you considered managing it jointly. I looked at the folder, then back at him. You mean you want to control what I own? No, he said quickly. We want to protect what we've all built. You didn't build it, I interrupted calmly. You inherited it, and you tried to erase me from it. Leora finally spoke. You've made your point, Mira. You got your share. You won. We're just asking you to think beyond personal grudges. This estate is about more than one person. I agree, I said, standing. It's about truth and legacy, and I won't share it with people who denied both. Elias leaned back, his voice low. This is revenge, then. I shook my head. No, this is restoration. They left without another word. They knew they had no leverage anymore. The will was ironclad, the ruling final, the story out. In the months that followed, things changed slowly, deliberately, and with meaning. First, I established the Isolde Foundation, named after my mother, to provide education grants for women in domestic labor. The first scholarship went to the daughter of one of the housekeepers who had worked in the estate during my childhood. Then, I opened the estate to the public on select weekends for historical tours, but not the sanitized, whitewashed versions the Ashfords used to tell. I made sure the real stories were told, the staff's names, their histories, their contributions. Gave my mother her place in that story. One section of the tour was dedicated entirely to the clock tower and the journal Alden left behind. I didn't paint him as a hero. I presented him as he was, complicated, human, and ultimately accountable. That transparency drew attention. Local historians, journalists, even a few academics came asking questions. Articles were written, not just about the Essendal affair, hidden for decades, but about how legacy can be reclaimed, reframed, and rewritten by those once silenced. People started talking about the Ashfords in a new way, not because of their wealth, but because of what their hidden daughter had chosen to do with it. Rowan reached out once more months later. Asked for a job. I'm trying to start over, he wrote. Nobody's answering my calls. My last investment tanked. I want a chance. I thought about it for a long time. Then I called him and offered him a position. Not as a director or board member, but as a groundskeeper for the estate's marsh conservation project. Honest, physical work, modest pay, full benefits. He hesitated. That's a bit low, he said. I said, it's what I used to do. It's where I started. He didn't take the job. I didn't expect him to, but the offer stood and he knew it. Dominic and Cellini faded from the public eye. They sold off their Hilton Head property quietly and were seen less and less at fundraisers and galas. No one wanted to be publicly associated with the family that lost everything to a maid's daughter. Society can be cruel like that, especially to those who live by its approval. But I didn't need their downfall to feel whole. That came one rainy morning when I stood in the garden with a cup of coffee, barefoot on the porch, watching the alias bloom under a gray sky. The wind moved through the trees the same way it had when I was a girl, but this time it carried no ghosts. The estate wasn't haunted anymore. It was mine, and so was the name.